the wonderful things that temples bring into our lives. May our hearts and our minds be open to thy message in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. Well, Lynn, thank you for the opportunity and for the nice introduction. You really ought to be giving this lesson, but I hope and pray that the things that I've thought to share with everyone will be relevant and meaningful to you. And if you want to use the chat function, you can ask questions or comments or things like that, and we'll try to be able to address some of the questions that you might have. And so Lynn has asked me to talk about the temple in 3rd Nephi. And this is a big topic, and it's one that I've spent a lot of time working on for a long time. Trying to condense it all is virtually impossible, but fortunately, much has been written about this. And I hope mostly tonight to just inspire you and tell you some stories and talk about some approaches and give you some ideas about what you might do in the coming weeks, as 3rd Nephi will be the topic for the Come Follow Me lessons. I think that the whole book of 3rd Nephi has to be read as an ensemble. It is a composition. We don't know exactly how much of the underlying text was provided by Nephi and how much Mormon dabbled with it or maybe even revised it. But my personal sense is the more time I spend with this, the more I think that Mormon was very cautious about making many changes. I think that Mormon would have been reticent to change anything in 3rd Nephi, just as you or I would be very loath to go in and edit the Gettysburg Address or Kennedy's inaugural speech. This material is so pivotal to the whole Book of Mormon. And Mormon wasn't there. But Nephi, who was the son of Nephi, the son of Helaman, was the high priest. And I think the first thing that's really important for you to realize as you get into 3rd Nephi is to look back on the life of this fairly young man, when you remember his father had been a marvelous prophet. We're reading about him now at the end of the book of Helaman. And we don't know why, but he and apparently his brother Lehi and others went off on another mission. Apparently they went to the land northward. We don't know, but they never came back. And they waited several years waiting to see what might happen. And in the meantime, of course, the prophecies about the birth of Jesus were bearing down on people, and those who were dubious about that were threatening to kill people. Now that made sense. We think, why would they want to kill people? But, you know, under their law, if you were a false prophet, the punishment was death. And if you followed a person who was known to have been a false prophet, you were complicit in false prophecy, and the law of Moses required that person to be put to death as well. So once the prophecy of Samuel, the 5-year prophecy, once that was then shown to be, if it didn't come to pass, a false prophecy. After all, as Jesus said, if you follow a prophet, you get a prophet's reward. And if the prophet's reward is death, then you suffer that same prophecy. Now you can imagine being the new high priest with your father gone. The high priesthood was inherited in those days. And so being the high priest, as we see from the lineage of Alma, was something that you inherited. And this Nephi must have been fairly young. I don't know exactly how old, but I'm guessing about 20 when all of that happened. That's the same person who will be designated by Jesus after the resurrection. And he appears and he calls 12 people and ordains them and gives them the power to baptize and eventually to give the gift of the Holy Ghost. And he is the chief of those 12. Interesting that Jesus honors the role and office of the high priest as he now fulfills all things. He says, I haven't come to destroy, and he doesn't even destroy the priesthood power of that righteous line of high priests. But this is the man who writes the book of 3rd Nephi. And he's the one who raised his brother from the dead. He's the one who organized the resistance against the Gadianton robbers and against the corruption in the city of Nephi. You have to read all of those chapters. They're ugly chapters, the beginning of 3rd Nephi, and you have to ask, why on earth does Mormon even leave that in? I don't think Mormon would have written it if Nephi hadn't put it there. And I think he trusted Nephi, that there was some reason, a spiritual reason, why people had to realize how dark things had become. Because the contrast in 3rd Nephi then becomes the exalted glory of Jesus Christ. And there's something about, the way things, the darker they get, the more problematic they get in our world. The Lord will always step in and compensate for those problems. And the contrast between the wickedness and the destruction and what happens in the first 9 chapters of the book of 3rd Nephi, with the glory that then comes, the unity and the holiness. I think the principle that there needs must be an opposition in all things, which was taught by Lehi, is being exemplified marvelously and purposefully for us, so that we can realize that no matter how difficult our problems are, no matter how bad the political situation gets, no matter who is creating difficulties even for ourselves, the power of the redemption, the resurrection, the glory, and the path that is then laid out through the teaching and the ministration of Jesus in the last half of 3rd Nephi is there to cure and solve all of those problems. So the interesting thing to me about the appearance of Jesus in 3rd Nephi 11 is where he chooses to appear to these people. There has been the 3 days of darkness, the destruction, earthquakes, whatever is going on, cities being sunk, burned. By the way, it's only Zarahemla that gets burned. And the burning of the most wicked part of the land is, I think, a part of this, because what's going on with all that destruction is purifying the land, ridding the land of anything that might defile the presence of God among them. So Jesus could have chosen to appear at the city center. He could have appeared out in a field somewhere or on a mountain just somewhere, but no, he chooses to appear at the temple. At the temple in Bountiful, where people had righteously separated themselves from the city of Zarahemla. They'd gone with Laconius for 7 years to starve out the Gadianton opposition. And those people, you realize, when they left the city of Zarahemla, they left the traditional temple that their people, the Nephites, had used for over 2 centuries. They abandoned their temple. In the ancient world, there's nothing you can imagine that would have been more haunting and demoralizing than to give up your temple. And they didn't have a temple in the land where they settle under Laconius until they finally do go to Bountiful, and there they build a new temple. They start new, and they are spared. And Jesus chooses to come to the temple. I look back on Jesus's ministry in Galilee and Jerusalem. And it's only the Gospel of John that tells us that Jesus went to Jerusalem many times, and he must have gone many times. Jesus was an observant Jew. He observed the law of Moses, which required attendance at Passover, at the Feast of Tabernacles, at the Day of Atonement. And he goes to Jerusalem on many of those occasions in the Gospel of John. And what does he do there? He always goes straight to the temple. Jesus recognized that the temple of Herod was not a proper temple. It had been built by a king with impure hands for political purposes and pretty extravagant in a lot of ways. He wanted a real temple, and he wept over it and wanted to restore the real power and functions of the Temple of Solomon. But Jesus loved the temple. One thing we can do in our own lives, I think, when we say we want to follow Christ, is we have to follow him to the temple. And in this day, in this month, this time of our lives, when we can't go to the temple, I think we can relate to Jesus, who couldn't often go to the temple and, in fact, wasn't really happy with what was going on there. He yearned for a pure temple, for a good temple. And when he comes to Bountiful, here in 3rd Nephi, he finds a pure temple. He finds a people that had been preserved through the destructions. And he opens up to them in a way that goes beyond anything that he could do in Jerusalem or Galilee to a large group. I think he opened up to his 12 disciples, his apostles. In fact, after he finishes talking in the first part of 3rd Nephi, chapters 11 to 14, he says to the people, "And now you've heard the things that I said before I ascended to my Father." I think he's referring there to the 40-day ministry between his resurrection and his ascension. 40 days later, he had talked to and taught many very precious and sacred things to equip the 12 apostles with all that they would need to know. How many of you are familiar with the 40-day literature? It's Brother Nibley wrote an article and actually printed it in a non-Latter-day Saint journal, of course, called Vigili Christiani back in the 1960s, called the 40-day ministry of Jesus. There's an article in the Encyclopedia of Mormonism on the 40-day ministry that gives you kind of an overview of what we know from apocryphal literature that Jesus taught to his disciples. This wasn't known very long ago. But through a lot of early patristic study and the kind of things that Brother Nibley did going through the Patrologia, he was able to identify the main themes that were taught by Jesus. And just as Jesus says in 3rd Nephi 15, the things that he taught to the disciples were the things that he teaches here in 3rd Nephi, those principles, especially in terms of temple ordinances and meaning. So with that little background, let me now switch to talking about what drove me, inspired me to want to know as much as I could about the Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon at the Temple here in 3rd Nephi. Of course, Brother Nibley was my Book of Mormon teacher my freshman year at BYU. And Robert K. Thomas was my second semester teacher. And then Truman Madsen was my teacher of the 3rd semester I had before my mission. For all three of them, the temple was extremely important. And they alluded to temple things. I hadn't been to the temple yet, but I would go to the Los Angeles temple in 1966 before going to Germany. And those experiences gave me a deep desire to understand as much as I could about the temple and to realize that there was a lot more going on there than my efforts and kind of initial awareness of those things could possibly grasp. Now, while I was in the LTM, the German language training mission, a very wise and bold person who was in charge of the LTM, I think he was called, he wasn't the president, but he was, I think the zone leader was what we called him. He came over to me one day and said that he wanted to see me 2 days later in his office, and he wanted me to recite to him the Sermon on the Mount auf Deutsch. Now, I thought when he said that he was talking about the Beatitudes, and I thought, well, yeah, I can do that. But it soon became clear that he wanted all 3 chapters of Matthew 5, 6, and 7 memorized in German. And I did that. I don't think I could do that quite so easily today. My memory isn't that sharp, but even in those days, I don't think I could have done that without the gift of the Holy Ghost. But it was one of the best things that I ever did in my life. And so let me encourage you to memorize the Sermon on the Mount or the Sermon at the Temple, whichever you want, the Book of Mormon version or the King James version in the New Testament. It can be recited in 35 minutes. So it's not like, you know, if you're in a Shakespeare play, your lines for Romeo are more than that. You can do this, but you don't know something until you really know it by heart. And Jim can tell you that you have to know the music by heart if you're really going to play it well. And guess what? When we go to the temple, if you're an ordinance worker, you learn these ordinances by heart. Memorizing is an important part of internalizing that, because you really don't appreciate the nuances and the rhythms and cadences and the meanings of the temple ordinances until you've gone through them and they have gone through you. So with that, let me fast forward to the 1980s when I had started Farms and we were doing the collected works of Hugh Nibley, and there were a lot of questions that were floating around about many things in the Book of Mormon. I had spent a lot of time studying the Greek New Testament, and I knew that there were several challenges in understanding the Sermon on the Mount just in Matthew. For example, who was there? It's very hard to analyze a work of literature, especially a speech, if you don't know who's in the audience. Matthew doesn't tell us. We have no idea. He gives us Matthew 5, 6, and 7. We don't know whether these are novices, whether these people are men and women, children. We don't know. Maybe they are already a select group of people, and he's giving some advanced instruction. Now, one reason I think that Matthew doesn't tell us who was there is because I believe Jesus gave the Sermon on the Mount multiple times. I think, you know, people ask me, why is the Sermon on the Mount not the same in the Joseph Smith translation of Matthew than it is in the Book of Mormon? And in Matthew 5 to 7 in the King James. Well, what if these are 3 different presentations of that? What if it is a ritual text and you modify it somewhat depending on who the audience happens to be? You wouldn't expect it to be the same. And then the question is for us as readers to ask, so why this nuance? Why is that different? Knowing what we know or can suspect about the audience. But that was one puzzle. Who was there? Another puzzle about the Sermon on the Mount was, why is Jesus doing this? And the traditional answer was always, he is an ethical teacher. He's giving good principles for how to live a moral life. He's obviously in tune with the philosophical schools of his day. He knows the kind of logic that Greek philosophers like to throw around, especially Stoicism. And so he's just a good moral teacher. Now that, of course, is a nice secular way of emasculating the Sermon on the Mount. But if that were the case, what are these punishments that Jesus is talking about? If he's just giving moral teaching, why does he tell someone to go and cut off his hand if it offends? Why is he saying that people who are not good covenant keepers, they will be like the salt that is cast out and trodden underfoot? He's talking here about excommunication from a society, from a religious group. That doesn't sound like just ordinary moral teaching. Why does he lead people and teach them how to perform a group prayer, which we call the Lord's Prayer? There are lots of things in the Sermon on the Mount that simply don't add up. They don't belong if this is just moral instruction. There's a third puzzle. When was it written? The world typically believes that the Sermon on the Mount was a scrapbook, that people remembered, especially Matthew, who after all was one of the 12 apostles. He remembered things that Jesus had said throughout his teaching. And here he did us a favor by just kind of cutting and pasting them. They're there in random order. They make no particular coherent sense. But that's a puzzle. If Matthew didn't write this and compose it, who did? And why do we see the passages in the Sermon on the Mount quoted so abundantly in the Epistle of James? Paul uses the Sermon on the Mount a dozen times in the Epistle to the Romans. People don't know this. What this tells us is that the Sermon on the Mount it exists before the 50s. And Hans-Dieter Betz, one of the people who has written the most complicated and authoritative commentary on the Sermon on the Mount, he's convinced that the Sermon on the Mount was in existence in its written form at least by 40, maybe even a little earlier. And I say, if it's there by 40, why didn't Jesus write it? Who would have written it that early if it hadn't have been Jesus? Now, personally, I believe that Matthew was a tax collector. And one thing that tax collectors and lawyers know how to do is write. And in fact, Matthew had his little, I'm sure, his little writing desk that he took around with him in order to write tax receipts, because he had to collect the taxes in the marketplace or wherever he was. If Matthew has his writing desk with him and he knows how to write, I believe Matthew was probably asked by Jesus, you're the secretary to the Quorum of the 12. Write these things down. And I think he wrote those notes, and I think he wrote especially things where Jesus said, this is something that you must teach word for word to people. And in fact, in early Christianity, the Lord's Prayer, which is in Matthew chapter 6, was thought to be so sacred that it was not shared, although it was used in early Christian worship. It's a little later that it finally gets out and it's publicized and everyone then knows it, but they don't know its original sacred context. Well, finally, there's a mystery about where was the Sermon on the Mount given. It just says that in the King James that they went up into the hill and Jesus talked up on a hillside. If you go to Israel, you'll probably be taken to a place by the Sea of Galilee and you'll be shown Here's a nice hillside, just 100 yards from the Sea of Galilee, and that's where Jesus sat when he gave the Sermon on the Mount. But that's not what Matthew says. Matthew says that Jesus went up into the mountain, eis to oron. Now, that is the same phrase that is used in Psalm 24. Who shall go up into the mountain of the Lord? He who hath clean hands and a pure heart, and so on. It's a euphemism for going up into a sacred place, especially into the temple. Jesus couldn't go to the temple, but he could go up into a mountain where he could then give sacred teaching. Now, if you're following me and anticipating where this is going, you'll realize that the Book of Mormon answers all of these questions, questions that the world simply struggles with. The Book of Mormon tells us that were plain and precious things that would be lost. And people, because of it, would first of all not understand the covenants. And then they wouldn't understand the gospel. And then they wouldn't understand the meaning of passages, and so they would take things away from the scripture. That's 1 Nephi chapter 13. But it begins by sacred things being, first of all, protected, but then being discarded because they weren't carried on and handed down with understanding, and that's what we call the apostasy. But what does the Book of Mormon promise? That the plain and precious things would be restored. And plain and precious things have been restored. We are told where it was. Jesus is at the temple. This is a sacred speech. This is in a holy precinct. It is given to people who are pure, people who are worthy, people who have all withstood and have already been told, I will have no more sacrifice by the shedding of blood. But they haven't been told yet what will take the place of that. And Jesus knows, I need to tell them what they should be doing next. And my own assumption is that they have been praying mightily together, led by Nephi. Oh Lord, tell us what we should do next. We are told why these things were being taught to the people. What happens in 3 Nephi 18 is the making of a covenant. The people weren't just there being instructed. They weren't just being taught nice things. They were being given commandments that they were then asked to take upon themselves as a part of the sacramental covenant when they partook of the bread, to remind them of the body, the physical body that they had touched and that Jesus had shown them, and to drink of the wine or the water. And there in 3 Nephi 18, it says that they will witness, that they will keep the commandments that have been given to them. Now stop and think about that. We hear that every week when we partake of the sacrament. But when had these people been given commandments? Oh, they had been given commandments earlier that day, right? And where are the commandments? You have heard it said of old, thou shalt not this, the old commandment, but I say unto you. Here's the new commandment. Those teachings, what Jesus is giving people according to the Book of Mormon, are those commandments that they will then take upon themselves by way of covenant. First by baptism, but then also by other things that 3 Nephi will talk about. These were the kinds of things that, first of all, got me wondering, what is the Sermon on the Mount doing in the Book of Mormon? And as you know, this is a favorite target for people who want to criticize the Book of Mormon without really paying much attention to it. They just see it as a shallow, simple, rip-off of things in the Bible. It's not plagiarism. It is very carefully differentiated You have to look at the differences and ask, why would this difference be there? And in every case, there are meaningful explanations and other things. But back to the 1980s, this had become a real hot issue among the the crowds and the critics and skeptics of who criticized the church. We didn't have a good answer. No one had really taken this issue on. I was teaching in the winter semester of 1998 an honors Book of Mormon class. And on one Wednesday morning, middle of January, fairly early in the semester, I had gone, taught my 8 o'clock morning class. My normal office was over in the law school, but at this time I had a little closet office in the basement of the Joseph Smith building. And I taught in the Mazer building, and so I decided instead of going back to the law school, I'm going to go to my study office in the Joseph Smith building. And I'm going to wrestle with this problem. Why is the Sermon on the Mount here, and what should we be saying to explain to people? Fortunately, there were no phones and no windows in that little office. And I sat down at 9 o'clock with a little computer that had green print on the screen. You remember that? It was a funny little computer, but anyway, I said, I just want to first, I'm going to outline everything that's here. I'm just going to start writing down what happened. I want to do the closest reading of this text I possibly can. I don't want to miss a single detail or a word. And I just worked with the Book of Mormon text. And I started making an outline. I first noticed that he was at the temple. I then noticed that there was a Hosanna shout. That's another temple recognition. Save now, Jesus. People came and they touched his body. They felt the wounds, the marks in his hands and in his feet. Jesus then ordained people to the Aaronic priesthood. By the time I got to the very end in 3rd Nephi, I said, oh, now he's given them the power to give the Holy Ghost. There must be 2 levels of priesthood, an Aaronic order and a Melchizedek order. Well, you can see where this is leading. The outline that I finally ended up with 48 elements, is published in a book called Illuminating, the Sermon at the Temple and the Sermon on the Mount. And Lynn, I think, sent you a link to that. And Lynn, I ordered this special for your class tonight. The whole book, Illuminating the Sermon at the Temple and Sermon on the Mount, was posted today in the Book of Mormon Central Archive. All of the chapters, everything right there, easily organized.
That's great, because not everyone on, I've been looking at the 153 machines here, not everyone on is on my email list. So just go to Book of Mormon Central and you can download it then if you don't have a copy of the book in your libraries. Thanks,
so there you have it for free. But as I go through a few of these other things, let me explain just some of them that really jumped out at me that first day, as I was saying, oh, wait a minute, this also is temple related. What about the Beatitudes? Well, I knew enough from the Greek to know that makarioi, which is the word for blessed, doesn't mean happy like the German translations. The word makarios means the status of a person in the next life, in the Elysian fields, who enjoys the fullness and the blessed state of eternal life. So the word really doesn't mean blessed. It should be translated exalted. And it doesn't mean blessed are the poor in spirit, because the Greek word are doesn't exist in the Greek. It just says, blessed the poor in spirit, blessed the pure in heart. But it's clear that these are all future tenses, which you could tell from the English. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall be called. They shall see. So the only tense in that Greek construction comes from the apodosis, the conclusion, and its future. So it should be translated, blessed will be the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. What are these beatitudes? They are promises of future blessings if you are true and faithful. Well, the temple begins with initiatory blessings where you are promised certain things that you will have. They aren't realized at that moment, but they will be at some point. I see the Beatitudes as the initiatory promises of this temple experience. You go on a little farther, and Jesus says, I have not come to destroy, but to fulfill. And in the Book of Mormon, it's very clear that anyone who does not keep and teach all the laws and obey these principles will be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. That sounds to me like the law of obedience. You must obey, and you must obey the full law. You go to the next one. You've heard it said of old, thou shalt not kill. But I say unto you, whosoever is angry. And the Book of Mormon doesn't say without a cause, by the way. That's King James. Book of Mormon just says anyone who is angry with a brother, who calls him fool, ridicules him, laughs at him. That kind of speech is not consistent with behavior under the law of the gospel. And then what is said? If you come to bring your sacrifice to the altar, remember that? And you realize that anyone there has aught against you, you must leave your sacrifice and go and reconcile. And then you can come and continue with your sacrifice or with your prayer around that altar. What's next? You've heard it said of old, thou shalt not commit adultery. Jesus then gives the law of chastity. What's after that? You've heard it said of old, thou shalt not forswear thyself. We don't even know what that word means, but it means don't make a covenant, don't swear by something improperly, and especially don't fail to keep your covenant. It's all about how you make your oath. How do we make covenants in this system? We don't pray by the great Jerusalem. We don't swear by the hairs of your head. How do we make a covenant here? Let your speech be yes, yes, or no, no. And that's how those covenants will be made. Well, we could go on through a lot of these details. All of what we've talked about so far in the You've Heard It Said of Old section is dealing with what might be called the Aaronic priesthood level of this ordinance. Jesus gets to the end of chapter 5 in Matthew or 12 in 3rd Nephi, and he says, there's more. I now want you to become perfect or complete, even as I or your Father in heaven are complete. And he goes on. What's next? The next chapter talks about not letting the right hand know what the left hand is doing, giving to the poor, consecrating your goods in the temple so that they can serve the purposes of caring for the poor and the needy. Then there's a teaching about prayer. First of all, he talks about how you pray when you go to your own closet, a private prayer. But then he says, but when ye pray, oh, this is a group prayer. This is differentiated from the private prayer. And you know, in the 40-day literature, it even says that Jesus then gave the Lord's Prayer, or prayers like it, and the apostles and their wives stood in a circle around Jesus, and he would go line by line, and they would repeat to him the words of the prayer. Brother Nibley's talked about that in his article on early Christian prayer circle. Well, I knew some of these things, but what I had not put together, and I got pretty excited about this. I said, really, how is this going to work out? What happens next? You know, and after the Lord's Prayer, it talks about washing and anointing. You wash yourself and you anoint yourself and fast. And then it talks about laying up your treasures in heaven, again, another aspect of the law of consecration. And then it talks about if you will do these things, you will be given a garment more glorious than the garment of Solomon. Solomon, the great king and high priest. You will have robes greater than a king in Israel. That's what Jesus promised his disciples. Now, the word to endow comes from the Greek word enduo, which means to get dressed. When you're endowed, you are dressed. And the word endumata, which is the noun, means garment or clothing. So you could even translate that you will be endowed with, or dressed with, endowed with endumata, garments even more glorious. Well, you don't have to scratch very hard, is what I'm suggesting. As you read through this text, to ask yourself, what is temple related at every step and every word of this way? You go to the last chapter, chapter 7 or 14. It's all about passing through the final judgment. Judge not, that ye be not judged, and here's the standard by which you'll be judged. And then he says, and do not cast your pearls before the swine, and do not cast the holy thing before the dogs. I've mentioned Hans Dieter Betz. He didn't know what we're talking about here, but in his commentary he says the holy thing might even be some sacred knowledge. Well, I think he got that one right. And by the way, the word for dog in Greek is kunos, kune. And we get the word cynic from that. The Cynics were actually a philosophical school. They called themselves the dogs. And Jesus says, don't cast your holy thing before the cynics. Well, I think he's not talking about, giving them dog food. He's talking about protecting sacred things that just shouldn't be indiscriminately given to people. And then what does he say? Ask, seek, and knock. You must put up a threefold petition. And if you do, what will happen? Who will be there? The Father will be there to answer your request for gifts. And will he give you a stone if you ask for a fish? No, if you ask for bread, he will not give you a stone. If you ask for a fish, and the fish is a symbol of Christ, he's not going to give you a serpent, a symbol of Satan. So you are knocking and you are hoping that, yes, you will be able to enter in through a narrow path, through a narrow gate. And then the very next thing he says is, for who shall enter into the kingdom of heaven into the presence of God. He who has done the will of the Father. And that expression is exactly the same as what Jesus uses and the Gospels use in Gethsemane, when Jesus does, not my will, but thy will. And then he says, well, you know, there are going to be people who will knock, and they'll come and they'll say, Lord, Lord, we've done, why don't we, let us in. We want to get in. And the Lord says, I'm sorry, I have never known you. And in some Joseph Smith renditions, you have not known me. It's a two-way street, either way. And to know someone in that culture doesn't just mean to be familiar with, but to have a binding relationship with, a covenant between. You have not entered into a permanent relationship with me, so depart, ye workers of iniquity. Well, there's more, but I just want to take you back to that little room in the Joseph Smith building, where on that day I didn't see these all in one order, because my mind would jump around from one place to another and say, well, here's another temple element, here's a different one. But then I was able to rearrange them on the screen, and I began to put them into the actual scriptural order and see them line up right against familiar experience to us. I took a deep breath and thought, I'm going to go and get some lunch. I opened the door and looked out in the hall clock. There was no clock in this room. And it was 4:45. The whole day had just been lost in one concentrated experience. And who should be walking out of his office and walking with me across campus? Stephen Robinson, a good friend of mine. We grew up together in the La Cañada ward in Southern California. We'd been at Duke together in biblical studies. And I asked Steve, has anyone ever thought of the Sermon on the Mount in terms of something related to the temple? Let me tell you a couple things, and I just gave him 2 or 3. He immediately said, this is amazing. No one has ever thought of this. I got home that night, and we, of course, had dinner, and Jeannie and I put the kids to bed, and okay, it's about 9 o'clock, and we finally sit down, and she says, well, what happened to you today? Did you have anything today? And I said, well, sit down, let me tell you. And we went through this as quickly as I could. Took about half an hour, as I recall. And she said, you remember not too long ago, Elder Maxwell asked you, if you ever find anything that you think he should be aware of, you should let him know. I think you should call him. It was a Wednesday night. I said, Jeannie, I know where they are on Thursday morning, and Dow Wilson knows where they are. And I'm sure Elder Maxwell does not want to hear from me right now. You need to call him. You need to let him know. And sure enough, he wanted to know, and he wanted to hear. He said, I will take this to the temple. I will let you know how I feel about this and what I think should be done. But he mused as we finished, because he could see exactly the power of this. And not only would it be good for faithful people and strengthening people's testimony of the reality of the restoration of the ordinances of the temple and the principles behind them in the Book of Mormon, but also helping to answer concerns and criticisms. He said, the scripture that comes to my mind is Ether chapter 12. If you will bring your weaknesses to me, I will turn them into your strengths. He said, what has been thought of as the Achilles heel of the Book of Mormon may turn out to be its greatest asset. Well, he did call me back after, it was actually on Friday when he got back to me. But he said several things that then led to the publication of this version of this book. This was published a couple years later by Deseret Book. It's called the Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon at the Temple and the Sermon on the Mount. I first published this in a Farms Know Why in March of 1988. Yeah, an update. I'm sorry, for Farms Update. And that same month, Hugh Nibley went on a 2-week trip to Egypt where we filmed him walking around in Egyptian temples, if you remember seeing any of that footage. But before Hugh left, he called me and said, will you take my Book of Mormon class for me while I'm gone? There are 5 classes I'd like you to take. And I said, well, sure. Where are you? And he said, well, you should start with 3 Nephi 11. We just got to 3 Nephi 10. So for those 5 lectures, I went through exactly this. In other words, the word got out fairly quickly. And the reception was overwhelmingly positive. I'm sure most of you have heard the passage in the Book of Mormon called the Sermon at the Temple. That's what I called it in that little Farms update, and what I called it here. And it's become kind of coin of the realm. We talk about that text now as the Sermon at the Temple, not the Sermon on the Mount, because it is different. And if you go to my notes, the John W. Welch notes on Book of Mormon Central, coming up in their sequence with the Come Follow Me material, you'll find a lot more of this material where I'm explaining, answering questions, and talking about this in even more detail. So those are some places where you might want to go. Let me just conclude by, not a brief conclusion. I don't know, I think we're about out of time, Lynn, but let me say, you got 6 minutes? People often ask me, so how do people out there receive this? You know, do only the Latter-day Saints get this? Or do biblical scholars also? Now, not all biblical scholars like what I've said. My book, which was published here, this one published in London, called The Sermon on the Mount in the Light of the Temple. This was published by Ashgate, not an LDS publication, but it presents, yeah, in the light of the Jerusalem temple. That's what this is all about. But that book has been very well received, and also just recently, a book has come out you might want to notice called The Temple in Early Christianity by Eyal Regev. He's a professor of biblical studies at the Bar Ilan University. He's obviously Orthodox Jew. He cites my book on the connection between the Sermon on the Mount and the temple. He's, of course, interested in Jewish temple connections, but he finds a lot there to engage with. There's another book called called 3 Nephi, and in 3 Nephi, an incomparable scripture. The lead article is one that I wrote called Seeing 3 Nephi as the Holy of Holies of the Book of Mormon. And Margaret Barker helped us to understand more about temple theology. And if you've seen Margaret recently on one of the videos the church put out when Jeannie and I took her through the Paris temple, and then she had comments about her experience there in the temple. She organized a group called the London Temple Studies Group, which I participated in for about 10 years. And all of these ideas have been vetted by academics. I presented a paper at the Society for Christian Ethics at the University of Cambridge, and people were quite blown away to have thought that the Sermon on the Mount has such coherence. And what I tried to explain to them was, how was it that the Sermon on the Mount was able to create a sense of morality that goes beyond just social thinking? And it all has to do with the commitment that people make in the process of receiving this temple experience. And finally, one of my main presentations to academics was at the SBL conference in the early 90s at Boston, where I spoke to on the panel of people dealing with the social scientific study of biblical texts. And where this tied in for them was, there's a whole group of biblical scholars who spend a lot of time asking, what is ritual and what is ritualistic in the Bible? We know there are certain rituals. We have a lot of ritual texts in the book of Leviticus and elsewhere. But where else are these rituals, and how can we tell when we are dealing with a ritual text? And there are certain clues that they use from an academic perspective to say, if you find these, you can be confident that this text wasn't just a nice poem, but it was like a hymn that was sung, like we have at the beginning of Philippians and Colossians and other places. Well, all of those clues are right here in the Sermon on the Mount. And I presented a lengthy paper to that group. And I remember especially the response of certain people who came up to me afterwards. I've had a lot of compliments over the years speaking on various academic occasions, but I've never had people come up to me like they did on that occasion to say, thank you. You have brought a spiritual dimension to our understanding of this text that we have simply, to our detriment, ignored or not seen. I had one person come up to me who was the president of a women's college. I can't remember her name. It all went by so quickly, but she said to me, thank you. I have come to these meetings of the Society of Biblical Literature for 20 years. This is the first time I have felt the Spirit in a room like this. Thank you for bringing the Spirit into this room. That wasn't my doing. It was the text. It was the sermon, the sacred nature, and seeing this text as a sacred text that helps people to feel the Spirit that Jesus wants us to experience and to build a relationship with Him by offering our will, by building upon His rock, by entering into the narrow way and abiding by every word that proceedeth from the mouth of the Savior. And these are the ways in which we, even though we can't go to the temple today, if you study the scriptures with the temple in mind, and if you realize that they go hand in hand, temple and scripture, they are all of one cloth. The warp and the woof of the fabric of our spiritual lives and of our community are found in the temple and in texts like the Sermon on the Mount. And if you will realize that you can't understand the temple without understanding the Sermon on the Mount and other texts like it that are sacred, ritual, and covenantal in nature, and if you realize that you can't understand those scriptures unless you understand the ordinances that they relate to in the restored temple. If you bring them together, it's kind of like Ezekiel said, put them together and the two shall be one in your hand. And it's that same kind of unity, that oneness that Jesus prayed that all of us would have, that we might be one with him, that we might be one with each other, that we might be united, that we might be at one through the at-one-ment, the atonement, and through the powers that we can accept as his disciples. He is the Lord. He is in charge. He has the way. He is the truth and the life. And he wants us all to come that he might say, enter into my presence. I pray that the Book of Mormon will bless your life in a way that you won't ever wonder, where's the temple in the Book of Mormon? It's there. Jesus didn't point it out because he knew that unless you have ears to hear, it will not bless you. But if you have eyes to see, then you will have the mysteries of the kingdom unfolded to you, Matthew 13. That's what he's telling his disciples. That's what he's telling us. I testify that he is and that he lives, and that he is just as much in our temple today as he was in the temple of Bountiful and as he was in the temple in Jerusalem. And I testify of that gladly and pray that the Spirit and all of the marvels of the Book of Mormon and the Scriptures will bless your lives. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen.
Amen. Thank you so much, Jack. We just got the tip of the iceberg, though. Make sure you look it up. Studying it on your own will even bring more of the waterfall of the Spirit, because it just goes deeper and deeper. And as you see the little children being encircled by fire, imagine the sealing of families, and you just keep going further and further into the text, and you see more and more temple symbols. It's just one of my favorite things to do in 3rd Nephi. Wow, Jack.
Okay.
You have over 150 new members of the Jack Welch fan club. And some of them already were members, so that's why I just cut it down to 150. But I was thrilled to see some of your family members here. Barbara, if you're still on, Barb, this is Jack's little sister. Do you want to give our closing prayer? And if she doesn't, Elise, do you want to offer our prayer?
Sure, I'm happy to.
Great, thank you.
Okay. Heavenly Father, we are so grateful for this day. We're grateful for the chance that we've had to come together and to feel of the Spirit and learn of thy scriptures and thy temple. And we ask that we may seek out further inspiration as we study these chapters with faith. And we say these things in the name of Jesus.
Although we use them as titles, originally they were more descriptors of the qualities, what it took to be in that position. You had to be disciplined to be a disciple. And the word deacon means a servant. You had to serve. A diakonos is a servant. So we still have a little bit of that with the office of teacher. That's an office in the priesthood, but it's also a generic, anybody who teaches is a teacher. So there's a double level of meaning, and you're right about the disciple having that same kind of ambivalence. And I don't know if there's any great significance in that, except to say that Jesus will take us all, and whatever our abilities are, he will then qualify us to do what he needs us to do. But we have to have his companionship to then really become not just a a learned one, but a true disciple. So it's an incremental thing rather than an all or nothing either or. Yeah.
Anybody else? Should we let Jack go to bed? Go ahead and come off your mute if you got a question.
I had one. This is Gabriel. I was wondering about when you were talking about how he gave different versions of this, I guess, endowment of his dispensation to different groups of people. I wanted to know if you thought that had any implications of things today, because we only have one version of the endowment in the Restored Church.
Well, let me say, first of all, that the endowment has changed over the years. Some changes fairly recently, and many in my own lifetime. And yet it's the same endowment. In a way, it functions the same. Yeah, it's the same. So I think we can appreciate as Latter-day Saints the living nature of the endowment and of the temple, and that it can be suited to our needs and our circumstances without somehow diminishing the essence of what it's all about. I know some people, it takes them a while to adjust. We all do. It takes us a little while to adjust to these changes. And I remember, not too long ago when the language in several of the ordinances, especially the sealing ordinance, was changed over a Christmas vacation a couple of years ago. And people came into the sealing office and wondered, one of them came up to me and said, "We were married 2 months ago. Do we need to be sealed again?" No, your sealing counted. Then they said, "Well, we wish it had been this way when we were sealed." And I said, "Well, more power to you. It has been changed, and it's your blessing just as if it had been that way when you were sealed." So I think that may be a good model for why Jesus might have done it differently, slightly differently. Some differences, of course, are perfectly obvious. When Jesus in Matthew says that if you don't settle quickly with your brother, you're going to go to court and you will be put in jail and you won't come out until you have paid the uttermost farthing, it says. Well, farthing is an English term, but there's an equivalent Roman coin that is being referred to there that's just a very small, a penny or so. Well, what does it say? He doesn't say farthing in 3 Nephi 12. He says, until you paid the uttermost senine, which is the smallest of the weights that was used in the Nephite economic system. Go back to Alma chapter 11. So he's speaking in terms that they would relate to and they would understand. And people say, oh, but would they have understood all of these kind of references to some biblical passages? And for example, "Depart from me, ye workers of iniquity," comes straight out of one of the Psalms. Now, Jesus' audience in Jerusalem or Galilee surely would have known that psalm. Did the Nephites know it? Maybe. If they did, they may have continued using those psalms as a part of their temple experience, because that was their hymn book. The Book of Psalms was their sacred collection of hymns, which they sang, especially on their pilgrimages to the temple and so on. So it's possible. Well, I believe that Lehi and Sariah, they knew this. They sang those songs. And I think they would have kept singing them with their family. And I think as they built the temple, they would have, these kind of songs and hymns had incredible longevity in ancient texts. The Homeric hymns were used for 1,000 years. So I think it's not impossible that a lot of these references or phraseology that Jesus uses could have resonated with people in Bountiful. Maybe not quite as much, but certainly they would have, I think, been able to understand that. So, but he does adjust some in some places. I think he's sensitive to his audience, and so there, I guess that would be my thought looking forward.
And I want to just clarify, Gabriel is a new convert, hasn't been to the temple. When we talk about changes, we are not talking about the signs and the tokens and the ordinances, but the story, the way we communicate the story has been changed. And the other thing I want to mention, since we're not all in Jack's stake or temple district, he is a sealer. So he is speaking very personally about those specific words that are changed that he has memorized for his office as a sealer.
There was a question in the chat from T. Terry that I thought looked really interesting, if that could be addressed. They said, thank you so much. What do you think were some of the most important things you did to prepare yourself to receive this revelation on the significance of the Sermon on the Mount? Was it memorizing it as a missionary a big contributor? And how did you decide it should be shared and wasn't just sacred personal revelation for your life?
Yeah, thank you for those questions. And yeah, absolutely, memorizing the Sermon on the Mount was a big step in my finally being able to let my brain just connect and put the synapses together and see the connections and you know, things that if it's not in your memory, you don't. I guess what I feel is if you just have an empty brain, the Spirit really can't move you, but if you put some blocks in there, the Spirit can move them around. And
three teachers too.
So
very influential.
yeah, and I did mention at the beginning also the you know, the work that I did with Hugh Nibley as my teacher, and at the time that in 1988. I was at that point serving as the general editor of the collected works of Hugh Nibley, and we had already published the first 7 of the collected works of Hugh Nibley, and we were working on the next 5 or 6 simultaneously. So we were deeply involved with a lot of the things that Nibley had taught. If you don't know about Nibley very much, the one book that you ought to look at in terms of temple is a book called The Temple and Cosmos is the title of it. It's a collection of about 7 or 8 of his lengthy studies on the temple. So that prepared me as well. But your question about how did I decide that it should be shared? And how far could I go? And, you know, obviously there's a question of you don't want to say more than you ought to. But I mentioned the conversations that I had with Elder Maxwell. And what I didn't finish up with was he then set up an appointment for me where I went and met with 3 of the brethren on the temple committee. And within a week, I had written the essence of the long chapter 4 in the book, Illuminating the Sermon at the Temple and Sermon on the Mount. And I submitted that to them, and they read it through, and then we spent the better part of a whole day going over this together. And at certain points they would say, let's say it this way, or let's not go quite this far. And I've been true to those instructions. I've tried not to go any farther than they felt comfortable. And another thing that, if you wonder, at least in this case, they allowed me to go maybe a little farther than other people might want to, but they wanted to see this because it was needed. And I trusted their judgment. And it was then published by Deseret Book. So that gives me a little more coverage, although I won't say that everything that's published by Deseret Book is somehow sacrosanct, but in any event, it's just one more level of caution. And I really do appreciate you asking this question, because I do wrestle with a number of things about how far to go in what to say and how to say it. And I hope we'll all be very careful with that. So let me see here. We've got another, just thank you. That's what you said about memorizing, although but my husband, who was a missionary in the South German mission, hooray, that was my mission. And I were ordinance workers at the temple 5 years in Oakland. Great. So this is the pause. And you served there in the South German mission 1960 to 63, and I was there 1966 to 68. So we missed each other, but thanks for that.
I'm also glad that the pause mentioned about their temple service. I noticed my husband's off. He's on another church meeting right now, but one of the things that was just mentioned in one of his meetings by Elder Cook this last week was, would you please have the saints pray that the temples can open? And since ours in Oakland is one of the few around the world that is not even in stage 1, let's fervently pray for that blessing to return to our community. Yeah.
The Provo Temple is now in phase 2, but it's opening slowly, and I think there is a reason for all of this, many reasons. I think we'll come out of this much more appreciative. Being away makes the heart grow fonder, and I think that.
Rich, do you have a question?
Yes, I'd like to pass along a comment I saw just today, that they've announced that it is now possible to submit names online for the prayer rolls.
Prayer roll, exactly.
And in fact, I did that myself for one particular friend who is going through a particularly hard time right now. And I went online, and I was able to navigate to the page and put the person's name in. And it may not go to the Oakland Temple because we're not doing endowments in the Oakland Temple right now, but it said if your temple is not currently operating, your request will be forwarded to a nearby temple. So
that is excellent. And going back to the Sermon on the Mount, it does say that you should pray for your enemies. You might think about putting some of your enemies on the prayer roll. Why are the Allens laughing at that?
Yeah.
Well, no, I really believe that. I've done that. But I think it at least helped me. I don't know if it helped them. But using the prayer roll is, it is certainly a very powerful thing. Lynn, you're Okay, now you're unmuted. Now you're muted. Okay, any, oh, there's one more question here. Are there other passages you feel are important to memorize? And on the top of my list there is King Benjamin's speech. Mosiah chapter 2, verse 9 to Mosiah 5:15. And I used to require my honor students to memorize the King Benjamin speech.
Jack, I remember that you memorized that in the LTM while we were there.
The Sermon on the Mount, that's right. Yeah. But I didn't do the King Benjamin speech until after that.
Yeah, I thought you'd been working on Mosiah, but that's fine. The fact that you were memorizing all of the scriptures and not needing to learn German was fascinating to me.
Yeah, it helped to have had some good German training before I started.
Was that Mosiah 2:9 through Mosiah 5:15?
That's right. That's yeah. And I actually alluded to a couple of those passages as we went along. Open your ears that they may hear. That's Mosiah 2:9.
Jack's written a book on King Benjamin that is one of his larger tomes. And for those of you that have been around a while, we took a whole semester and just went through that book as an institute class. And we spent the whole semester just on King Benjamin's sermon. It has a lot of the messages on the temple that he's referring to here in that text. If you'd like to borrow it, I've got a copy. Anyone's happy to use it.
Good. No, and it's King Benjamin's speech and the sermon at the temple are, you know, they are the pillars of the temple of the Book of Mormon for me. And everything runs in and out of them sooner or later. So, and they were both temple speeches, both covenant speeches, as we said. Okay, question about, okay, we've got a question about the difference between statutes, judgments, commandments, and why they're called out individually and listed together sometimes throughout the Book of Mormon. Yeah, the answer to that is that this is called a pleonastic list. And in Hebrew, they have a whole bunch of different words that are used to describe a different part of their law. They have the commandments. And these are well, you know, the statutes are the judgments. Statutes are the decisions of the mishpatim, and you have the mitzvot, the commandments, and you have the hokah and the hok, these different kinds of types of law. Where is law coming from? And if you look in Psalm 19, where you have a song that is singing about the beauties of the law and all of its facets, and what the attitudes of ancient Israel were about the law was that the law was divine. Every word was important. The Pharisees, of course, took this to an extreme, but they didn't want to miss any one portion of the law, and they wanted to be as precise as they possibly could be. And so when they talk about doing things according to the statutes, judgments, commandments, what they're saying is, we want to do all that the Lord has commanded us. So it's kind of a way of just saying, you know, the whole banana. And sometimes the word testimonies, the edut, get thrown in there. But it is interesting that the Book of Mormon uses that same list that you'll find several times in the Old Testament. I could say more about that, but
What's the difference between a statute and a commandment? That might be interesting.
Yeah, well, a statute, if we think of statutes as laws that are passed by a legislature, and of course these people didn't have a legislature. And so the Hebrew word behind statutes is the hukah. And that just means the customs, or the ordinary way that things were done. The order. You can have an order that is an order of an official, but you can also have an order that is the order of the community, or the holy order of the priesthood. So these words, they have authority behind them from different sources. And so the judgments, when it talks about the judgments, in the law of Moses, you'll run across passages that say, if a man does such and such, if a man should do this, or if a man that, then you have a ruling on what should happen if that particular instance or situation were to arise. And those are called the mishpatim because they look like judgments that somebody might have made, or they act as judgments. They're precedents. So we have a lot of these different kinds of things in our legal system. We have judgments, we have decisions, we have opinions, and it's all a part of the legal framework. And so it's not, I don't think it makes a whole lot of difference what you call them, but the commandments, the 10 commandments, these are the orders, thou shalt not. And the commandments are, I would say, of the most fundamental, and they are usually the most important. The other things are judgments dealing with, say, economic problems or torts, or what do you do if somebody steals your cow or your chickens? The Bible talks about those sorts of things too. So I don't know if I hope that helps a little bit.
That was great. And I also wanted to explain that little voice that we keep hearing in the background is Jack's helpmeet. This is his partner in crime, his equal in all senses. Jeannie, you got to come out and let everybody see you. I know you're not on another machine just because of the problem with the overlapping delay in the sound, but Jeannie is Jack's wife and she doesn't want to be seen right now, but anyway.
Very, very comfortable where she is.
Jeannie, thank you very much for adding in lots of encouraging thoughts and words. That was not me who was making all those comments, that was Jeannie.
Oh, and one last thing on the statutes, judgments, and so on. I suppose I wasn't very clear on that. But if you go on Book of Mormon Central, there is a know why that says, why do they talk about all these different kinds of terms relating to the law? And you'll find a better answer there. I mean, it's my answer, but it's...
Yeah, I didn't say it's still yours.
Time to work out. Okay.
Oh, this has been
Thank you, everyone. Thanks very, very much. And
good night, Jack. Thanks so much. Really appreciate it.